Welcome to our webinar entitled Why Didn't Hillary See What Was in Plain Sight? I'm Andrea Simon. I'm a corporate anthropologist and president of Simon Associates Management Consultants. This was an area that was of particular interest to us that I wanted to share with you. Why, in fact, wasn't it easy for Hillary and her folks to see what was in plain sight? Wired.com, right after the election, wrote, "Trump's win isn't the death of data." Quote, "Before Donald Trump won the presidency, everyone from Nate Silver to the New York Times to CNN predicted a Trump loss and by sizable margins." I guess their data was flawed. Since the election, there has certainly been a lot of reflection on what happened to Hillary's election. So why didn't she, the Democratic National Committee, the press, and most of all the pollsters see what was coming? Trump's people certainly saw the trends. President-elect Trump's people sure did. They were able to gauge which way the winds were blowing far better than the more traditional forecasters. And all of that tweeting did just what it was supposed to do, sway voters his way. The Wall Street Journal article, right after the election, suggests that some polls, such as the USC LA Times Daybreak poll, used algorithms and a grading process to try to accurately ascertain how people were going to vote. But the trends were trending, and these methods suggested that voting was trending toward Trump. Did Hillary's team miss what was right before them? Traditional pollsters were going in different directions. Polls using more traditional data based on historical patterns, which proved inaccurate given the nature of the campaigns and how news is found and shared today, failed to see what was happening. As Cade Metz writes in the Wired article I mentioned, this wasn't so much a failure of the data as it was a failure of the people using the data. It's a failure of the willingness to believe too blindly in data and not to see it for how flawed it really is. So it's not the data, it's the stories about the data that make a difference and sway elections. Perhaps this is the perfect time to drive home the fact that data do not exist. Anthropology 101, data do not exist. Anthropology teaches students and you that data, whether soft observational research or cold hard numbers, essentially does not exist when taken out of context. The US election is a perfect example. The pollsters' brains kept seeing what their mind maps believed was true and discounted data that didn't fit their own models of a perceived reality. There is no reality, just a perceived one. Here's how the mind map actually works. To make sense of data and reality, the brain converts it into stories so it can visualize it, really understand what it thinks it means, and then tell that story and share it among others. But the brain hates to change. So whatever the brain's mind map starts out with dominates how humans, and in this case pollsters, sort and visualize their data. Pollsters were selecting the data that fit. Basically, your brain takes in the information it likes and discards the rest, which leads us to the failure of the pollsters. This is what typically happens. Were they just looking for what they wanted to see, expected to see, ignoring anything that ran counter to their own perceptions and projections? Maybe they even disregarded the new data. Or were they looking at the wrong data and or using outmoded methods of gathering it, such as calling people home on landlines, which has been mentioned quite often? They certainly failed to tap into social media. They failed to tap into methodologies that were readily available today to capture the conversations taking place on social media. My guess, all of the above. There was a lot of good data telling them things. And as the graph below from TechCrunch reveals, social media was revealing early on how well Trump was connecting with his audience. Did Hillary and her team not see the patterns emerging? They were available. This is the graph I'm referring to. As you can see, the red line, Donald Trump, and the blue line, Hillary Clinton, is looking at the conversations in social media and the sentiment, and there are wonderful tools to analyze it. But you can see, regardless of what was taking place, Donald was simply on top, And it was a period of time when they were almost tied, and then Donald soared again right at Election Day. How could a little anthropology have helped? A little field work might have helped them. How different might the outcome have been if Hillary's team had taken a page from the anthropologist's notebook and headed out into the field to listen to what people were saying? It was out there, if they had only opened their ears to hear it. I certainly heard it. They need to begin to listen with an open mind. As I traveled around the country working with CEOs of mid-sized companies, I don't have to listen to them very long to hear what's bothering them. Throughout this election season, they weren't necessarily pro anyone, but they were out of patience with the Obama administration. What were they ticked off about? Stronger Together wasn't about them. First, there were the new labor laws that were costing them money and really infringing on the way they ran their business. The new healthcare costs were really impacting them, and to them not necessarily gaining the advantage expected. The new SEC rulings for some were an issue. It appeared to them that there was no one who was caring about them and their business in particular, and business in general. And there was a feeling that business was not at the top of anyone's agenda in the Obama organization, or for that matter, in Hillary's. How to keep business growing? They were worried about how to sustain their company's value, keep it growing, and manage the millennial workforce while the government piled on more and more regulations. And with the new global economy, they weren't sure how they could compete in the coming years with our country's trade agreements. Doctors, too, were very discouraged. About a third of our business is with physicians, healthcare organizations, and others dealing with the changes coming from CMS as healthcare shifts from one payment model, volume, to a new one, value. While they would recognize the fact that healthcare in the United States was approaching 25% of the GDP, and it was unsustainable, they weren't going to change in order for others to reduce costs and improve the quality of care. It wasn't really their problem, they thought, and they weren't going to continue to vote to support these changes. One doctor said it so well, although I could have told you many. So while I could share any number of physician comments, this came from an anonymous blogger on kevinmd.com, which I read often. This doctor is an independent physician who said, quote, "She's still hanging on by a thread, but still hanging on," end quote. Between costs for staff and reduced revenue from payers, whether it was commercial insurance, Medicare, and Medicaid, she voted for Trump because she needs a change. She's an independent and wants someone to help her stay that way. She remembered Hillary from the last time. She remembers, quote, "I was in med school in the 1990s when Hillary was in charge of modifying the health system. If you remember the HMOs, then you remember the fiasco that healthcare became with Hillary Care, with many doctors closing up shop. Our own family doctor retired early and actually warned me not to go into medicine." Who was listening? The Democratic campaign didn't seem to bother to listen to them. The core of America's mainstream desperately wanted a change, and on November 8th, they elected someone they think will bring it to them. If Hillary and her team had tapped into these concerns, she might have connected with these voters. Instead, all she got on November 8th was a loud no thanks. So are you too missing what's in plain sight? What does this mean for you? Bias and blindness await you. Are you letting your own biases and mind maps filter reality to affirm what they believe, your mind and mind maps believe to be true, ignoring what is actually happening? Are you looking at old data points while new ones are staring you in the face? If so, perhaps you better wake up and fast. I always tell my customers are talking to you. Can you hear them? This is time to start.